I'm very proud of you all for braving the snowpocalypse and coming out today. Uh, let's see, gosh, we haven't seen each other in a while. Again, I apologize for making you guys do the Zoom meeting last time. All my cars were broken, so it goes. They're both fixed now, in case any of you were wondering. We did not have to walk here. What else I want to say? I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get some attendance points for being here. So I would love to hear from you guys about any questions you have, any thoughts you have on the course so far, anything from last week about the interstellar medium. I'm going to do something crazy today, and we're going to stop talking about physics for one class, and we'll actually start looking a little bit at how cosmologies are composed, like what's in a cosmology and what is, what made a cosmology so important to people in the past. Because obviously this course is ultimately leading up to a cosmology. We even have departments of cosmology now at big research universities, but they do entirely physics-based studies, which is unique because cosmology used to be a much bigger concept than just physics. So I want to look at how that happened today. Before we get there, though, I would like to hear from, I think I can pretty much hear from everybody here today due to the snowpocalypse. So say hello, tell me some thoughts. Yeah, remind me your name again, I'm sorry. Abigail, that's right. Some gory details, yeah. The worst thing you could do is be inside of something like water when a bomb goes off, actually, because it's incompressible. Air is at least a little bit compressible. So if somebody throws a bomb at you, don't jump in a swimming pool. That's not going to help. Good to know. What else? Yeah.
Variable between different theories.
Is it Cassandra, by the way? Cassandra, all right.
One being like the expanding contracting gas theory, and then they have the lattice and liquid changing structure theory, where it's like the lattice is changing, making it brighter and darker, while the other one is like you're pushing the force.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about those variable stars as we go forward. I want you guys to start thinking about that. Like, start thinking about each one of these theories and how it's going to be different if there's a liquid model versus a gas model. I think your final project is going to have something to do with that. I'm still kind of cooking it up a little bit. I'm changing it from last year. I want you to challenge you guys a little bit more. So, every time I start comparing how some system is going to differ, pay attention and think about, if that makes sense to you or doesn't, because now is a great time to ask questions about it before I set you loose on a research project with respect to it. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Almost every single story we talk about in this class is going to have two different endings, depending on whether the stars have a liquid nature or a gaseous nature. And I think that's kind of the most important thing in all of astronomy right now. So I want you guys to keep thinking about that. What else, guys?
I thought it was interesting how you said that to get back to the starting point on an atom, you have to rotate it twice.
That is pretty weird. Yeah, the electron, in general, all of the matter components of an atom have that same spin 1/2 symmetry, which is really bizarre. I like to model it as the surface of the atom, the electron. I think the chemists also tend to do that. Particle physicists don't really have much of a physical model for the atom, so it's more about what their measurements show them in these particle colliders and stuff. So you might not ever hear that again if you take more chemistry or physics classes. But I think that it's certainly, the spin quality is an angular momentum. It has to do with motion. And naturally, if we're talking about the electron, it needs to concern the outside of the atom. And so I think a reasonable way to model it would be kind of the drawing that I showed you guys, which does involve not only a surface rotation, but an involution. So this is a model that I've been trying to construct for that, along with the lovely Dr. Benderbury, who's sitting in the corner over here today, my wife and partner. What else, guys? That's a good point. That is bizarre. Spin flipping in general is pretty weird. Yeah, Rook, is it?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that most of the ozone isn't ionized, but that anything we can see has to be ionized.
It is tricky, yeah. So these radio telescopes have helped a little bit because this spin flip that I was just mentioning was a really a good insight, because those even these neutral hydrogens do a little bit of light. It just happens to be this really long wavelength light that's in the radio range that we weren't aware of before that. So yeah, that's pretty cool stuff. Yeah, interstellar space is packed with atoms. That's what's really fascinating. There's currents and magnetic fields. So the atoms are doing stuff. They're just very few and far in between. Like I said, there's something on average between stars, a single atom every cubic centimeter. And so, it's kind of anybody's guess what that looks like, but I have a sense that atoms, when they're depressurized, they sort of tend to expand to fill that space. And so I don't think interstellar space is necessarily empty, despite the fact that it has so few atoms. I think that they just change their shape a little bit, which is congruent with the idea of ionization. Instead of having an electron just pop off like a little bowling ball and fly around and do something magical, you can think of the surfaces, the electron surfaces of the atoms actually in contact with each other doing something, which I think is a lot more rational and mathematically equivalent. So that's kind of interesting. Glad you brought that up. What else, folks? Say hi. In the back. All right, then let's talk about cosmology a little bit. This is really our one chance to just take a step back from the physics a little bit and talk about what we're trying to do here and why in the world it is that the physicists are in control of cosmology, which might seem perfectly natural to you, but it actually wasn't really a thing until about the 1960s. So if you go back hundreds, thousands of years, let's just even go back hundreds of years, cosmology was always thought of as a discipline of the religious studies, actually. So the word cosmology, we talked about it a little bit, but it essentially is something like, what is our relation to this universe as human beings? How did the universe come to be the way that it is, and who are we in relation to that? That's a really interesting question to have end up being in a physics department. Traditionally, that's been the domain of different mythologies and religions. So, one of the things I play with a lot is what makes us human exactly? What makes us different than animals? I mean, what do you guys think? If you had to say one thing that makes us different from other animals, what is it? You ever thought about that? Yeah. Cooking. That's pretty cool. That's a really interesting idea. Yeah. What do you think?
Say communication.
Communication. That's really interesting. So let me pick on that one a little bit. So communication. So, birds and monkeys and stuff seem to kind of chatter at each other a little bit. How's it different? Anybody? What's kind of weird about human communication?
A
Different?
lot more complex than pretty much every other species.
Does seem to be complex, yeah, in an interesting way. So birds, will have a song that they all learn and they'll perfect it. And there's some competition about who can sing the best version of that song, but most birds are singing, and there's some exceptions, like crows are very unique. They seem to have different dialects and stuff. But there's something about the complexity of human language. I'll give you that. I would go like one step further, though, and I want to see if anybody can pick up on it. What's special about, yeah, in the back. Okay, what's that mean to you, though? Thought. I think that's exactly in the right direction. I think there's something really interesting about what we mean when we say thought, which is really interesting. There's a huge argument too that's been long-standing in the linguistics community, in the biology community, about whether you can have thoughts without language. So I don't know if this is the same for you guys, but if I'm like, trying to think about something, there's generally a voice in my head that's it's me, and I'm talking to myself, and I'm kind of working it out, I might have a thought like, oh, is class gonna be canceled later today, I was like watching the weather report because I live far away, and I'm like, but I'm literally saying that to myself in my head, right? So there's an argument from the linguistics community and the evolutionary biology that we couldn't really organize and have thoughts without being able to talk. Even if we talk to ourselves in our own head, did thought arise at the same time that this language thing arose? Yeah.
There are plenty of people though that have abstract thought, and
nonverbal, like visual thought that isn't necessarily derived directly from verbal communication.
I agree. I completely agree. The abstraction in the visual space is really interesting. And so there's an argument that like perhaps animals are, and I think there's plenty of evidence that animals can have abstract thoughts by degree that aren't related to speech. But it does get us into the realm of not talking just about complexity, but about abstraction, which is really interesting. So I think that if, and you guys can push back on this, but for me, when I look at what separates humans in the way that we think from other animals is the degree of abstraction we're capable of. So, I think at some point in this class, I pointed out to you, like, what is an abstraction? The most simple abstraction possible is something like motion, right? So you have like some physical objects, they have one location, and then you change it, and there's a relationship that develops between the former and the latter. It's a really simple abstraction to imagine. But humans have the ability to infinitely nest their abstractions, and the linguists call this recursion. So I can say something, I can express a thought where I just unendingly modify it. I went and got in my car. Then I could say, I went and got in my car to drive to Ashland. And then I could say, I went and got in my car to drive to Ashland to teach a course. Then I could say, I went and got in my car to drive to Ashland to teach a course about mythology today. And I could literally go forever like this. I can keep modifying that abstraction forever. And that seems to be something that we don't yet have evidence for in other regions of the animal kingdom. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and there are some really cool people doing work about that to try to understand it, especially with stuff like crows and whales and so forth. But what I'm trying to get back to is that this ability to tell abstract relationships in an infinitely nested form seems to be at the heart of what it means to be a human, to me anyways, because the fundamental way we do that is through something called a story, right? I think I've probably touched on this before, but it's like, how do you convey information to people? You tell them stories, right? It could be a joke, it could be a funny story, it could be a drama, it could be a poem, right? So it's very pleasant to listen to and memorable because it has a rhyme scheme, perhaps. There's a lot of ways to tell stories, but and I could tell a theory of, how the stars are formed. That's a story also. And so there's something really foundational about the way that we relate information to each other through stories. And what I'm kind of working towards is that a cosmology is kind of like the biggest story you could tell with like the most softened corners on the abstractions possible. It's like trying to tell a story about everything all at once. And the way that people have done that in the past is through mythology. And what's kind of fascinating is that they've usually pegged their mythologies to the stars in the past for thousands and thousands of years. So, whenever we talk about stars today, we look to physicists to tell us how the stars work, how they're made, how they die, what's the fate of our star, stuff like that. That's a brand new thing, right? So for most of human history, if you went to somebody who knew a lot about stars and asked them what was going on in the sky, they would probably relate to you a story about something that reflected something about our lives on Earth that was playing out in the stars as well. And so that's just a very, very different approach. And in some ways, it's more amenable to a cosmology about the whole universe because, as you guys probably figured out, talking about physics isn't the whole story of your lives, right? When you go through your daily lives, most of the stories you tell have nothing to do with physics or physical relationships at all, in that sense, right? A lot of stories about how you're feeling and how, your relationships are modified between you and your friends and so forth, right? These are not physical stories. These are not physics stories, and yet they're a huge part of the universe. And so in some sense, it's kind of strange and alienating that the cosmology that we have today that explains the universe to ourselves doesn't have any elements of the humanities in it, really. It doesn't have anything about purpose, meaning, relationships to one another, and so forth. And that's really, really new. That's not the way that most of human history has gone. So, for many, many years, I think mythology was king. I think that people did have practical aspects of their stargazing as well, right? So I think I showed this one to you guys before, maybe the first day of class, maybe it was last semester, forgive me if I can't remember. This is a 32,000-year-old carving in a stone. It's in a bone, actually, a piece of bone. And, people analyzed this, and they found that actually these notches and so forth represented actual locations of stars during the time period in which this was carved. They originally kind of overlooked it because the stars were in a different place back then than they are today. The Earth, like I said, obviously is revolving around the sun, but the sun is revolving around the Milky Way. And so that the location of the stars and the way that they appear in the sky due to the parallax, right, is going to change. And so when people first found this artifact, they focused on the kind of mythological person involved in it. Only later did they realize that it represented Orion in the sky and the belts of Orion, and that there was all this intricate, actual observational, for lack of a better word, science, like actual observational data encoded in this. So it seems like even 30,000 years ago, that's way before history started. We don't have any writing until maybe 6,000 years ago, if we're lucky. So people had been trying to make practical maps of the sky while superimposing mythological structures on top of it for tens and tens of thousands of years, if not longer. So this goes all the way back, and like this is a famous cave painting, kind of a similar situation, where people first saw the cave painting and they were like, oh, that's nice, there's like these primitive, cavemen or cave women, whatever, kind of drawing their lives, like they're out hunting bulls and stuff, that's kind of quaint. And then later, decades later, somebody came back and started looking at these dots that were on there and realized that these were actually really precise maps of these different constellations at the time. And what's fascinating is that the constellations that they actually end up outlining are the same names that we use for those constellations today. We still have an Orion Hunter in the sky. We still have this Taurus constellation, right? So, this cave painting is from almost 17,000 years ago. Long, long before any kind of written language that we know of or anything like that. But these stories still persist to this day. We still refer to this as this Orion hunter guy, and we still have this Taurus bull that's in the sky even today. So these are really, really important figures to us for even up to this day, except we've kind of stopped talking about them in terms of actual astronomy and cosmology. They haven't really made it into our cosmology at the present moment. So, there's plenty of examples of this I could go into, where people are both trying to practically capture the locations of stars, presumably for navigation, but it's really anyone's guess. We don't have a written record of that. Presumably there's lots of practical reasons to know the locations of the stars. You can time your harvests. Maybe you can time your pregnancies. There's lots of things that you would want to do with respect to that, when to migrate to different locations for hunting and gathering. But they're also encoding these stories about how we should live. So something interesting kind of happens. The tradition that we're all a part of in this classroom is this Western tradition that really dates its roots back to back down through Rome and down, through Middle Ages Europe, down through Rome, down through ancient Greece, and eventually back to Mesopotamia and the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians, who really were the first organized version of anything approximating astronomy today. So they made these, particularly the Babylonians, made these really, really accurate star maps. They were obsessed with watching the sky. And it was also the first place that you see the birth of anything approximating a state, which is kind of interesting, right? So what's the job of the state today? Anybody? Why do we have, and by state I just mean country, right? Like the federal government, for lack of a better word. Like, why do we have a state? Why have people all agreed to this? Because in some sense the state's kind of annoying, right? It tells you can't drive a certain speed on the highway. It's very restricting in some sense, but we all kind of agree to it. Why is that? Yeah.
Regulate our social contract.
Yeah, social contract. Tell me more about the social contract.
It's a term to use in philosophy that says that kind of goes back to how we treat each other and how we want to be treated, and then it's about pretty much our responsibilities to each other and how to stay safe and alive and morally apt.
Yeah, yeah, well put. The social contract's an interesting theory of why we agree to this. Like, why do we agree to let somebody regulate our speed limit on the highway? And like, the ultimate answer is because it, in some sense, makes our lives more safe and convenient if we don't have to worry about some bandit busting through the front door and sticking us up all the time, right? We agree to give somebody, like, somebody has all of the power to hunt down bandits in this city right now. There's a police department, right? And their job, and then the police department catches the bandit, and somebody else's job to prosecute them and decide how they're going to be punished so they don't keep committing crimes. And so this very organized system that we come up with where we delegate authority, particularly the authority of force, right? It's often called the monopoly on force, right? You're not allowed, I mean, obviously, you're allowed to have some weapons for hunting and so forth, but you're not allowed to have, I don't know, a Tomahawk cruise missile, right? Like, in general, you're not allowed to have, like, I don't know, an Apache gunship or something, right? We generally give that authority for ultimate force to a small segment of the population who we entrust with upholding the social contract, like Rook says. So this is kind of interesting that this doesn't appear in the archaeological record prior to about 4000 BC. There's nothing like that. There's nothing obviously like a state. Now, there may have been states prior to 4000 BC when the Sumerians pop onto the scene, and that to a lesser clear extent, the Indus Valley civilization, the Yellow River civilization in China. There's a few of these that kind of pop onto the scene around the same time. And there's some hints of it prior to that. There's a site in Turkey that's gotten a lot of attention with some megalithic structures, but it's not clear that anybody had really tried that out too much before the Sumerians. And what's really interesting is as this state appears and this social contract appears, you start to see this specialization, where not only is, war, let's say, force, brute force, delegated to an army or to some sector of the population, but also stuff like astronomy, which is really interesting. Also stuff like mythology. So the Sumerians had a state mythology, right? It's often maybe thought of as a state religion. And I'm going to pick apart the difference between myths and religions in a second, but basically, there's a homogenization of the culture at that point that's enforced. There's actually an authority that says, this is our mythology, this is our gods, this is how we see the stars, this is how we interpret the stars, and that's what everybody's going to go by. That's sort of the cohesion, in some sense. There's this cohesion of narrative introduced where people kind of agree to give in to these overarching stories, really, to come back to the word story. So I think that from the earliest days, mythology, state authority, they're kind of merged. There's not really any difference between the state and the religion. It actually goes one step further than that, because in Sumeria, and in Babylon, which succeeded Sumeria, and you see this in Egypt too, you see this in ancient Maya in Mesoamerica as well. The leader of the state is not just an elected official. The leader of the state is actually treated as an embodiment of the supreme god of that civilization. So if you're in Sumeria, the kings and in Babylon, which came after and kind of inherited a lot of that culture, the kings are all named, their first name is always Marduk. And Marduk was the supreme god of that civilization. And you might think like, oh, that's really interesting. Is that just like some superstition or something? Why do you guys think they did that? Why did they force their leaders to, or not, I'm not even gonna say they forced them. Why did they expect their leaders to be gods, basically, and to take on the names of their supreme god and so forth? Any ideas? Because like this is very different than the world we live in today, right? Our leaders, politicians are notoriously scandalous. very little subservience to any higher power. But back then, it was like no difference between church and state in the beginning, in the very earliest stages of statehood and civilization. Why do you think that it was set up that way? There's like a cynical version and maybe a more practical version. Yeah, what do you think?
Power.
It does. I mean, that's certainly, I think that's perhaps the cynical side of things, that it does, and I think it's true. It does like imbibe them with authority because obviously if they're synonymous with the supreme deity, well, you better listen to them, right? Because they have control over the heavens and the earth and everything like that. So that's probably part of the reason. What if I told you that sometimes they would just kill off their leaders if they weren't behaving themselves, right? And they would get a new Marduk, right? So there's this element of expectation as well, right? There's like a real expectation that, hey, we're going to call our king, or, you know, the equivalent of our president, and we're going to name it after a god, and if it doesn't behave like a god, right? That's a really interesting expectation to set up too. It's like we expect our leader to be upholden to these higher principles, and if they're not, get rid of them and get a new one, basically. So that's kind of interesting, and I think that like when people think about these early days where religion and the state are tied up into one device, we think about the horrors of the Middle Ages where, you know, the church was leading all of these crusades kind of senselessly, and there's this kind of arbitrary authority invested in the church, and there's all this terrible drama, which is true. There's serious problems with tying the state to religion, but there's also some benefits that come from it too, which is that your leaders are actually held to a standard that is kind of otherworldly. You actually expect your leader to behave in this really high moral fashion that, you know, we seem to have gotten adrift from today. So, you know, I think a lot of people, by the way, do you guys know where Babylon is physically? It's smack dab in the middle of Baghdad, essentially. It's in Iraq, which is, of course, a bombed-out hellscape right now. It's also a desert. It wasn't back then. That's what's kind of, you got to really kind of tune your imagination about where this was all happening. So this all happened in the few millennia after the glaciers, the last ice age, after the glaciers started melting. All of this water was just flowing, right? A lot of fresh water, a lot of just nice swampy alluvial plains where all this fertile soil was piling up. It was a really, really nice place. Have you guys ever been to like a river delta area before? Like New Orleans, or what else is a good one? It's a good delta. Gosh, anybody? They're really, really nice and fertile. So it's a great place to grow crops. You know, rice paddies famously in the Southeast Asia are all this very delta fertile kind of region. I think it was kind of similar in Baghdad and around Iraq, right there at the Persian Gulf. It was very similar, rich, fertile, beautiful green environment. Very different than we think of today. Egypt was like that too. Actually, just prior to the rise of the Egyptian civilization, the Sahara was green. That's hard for people to imagine. The biggest desert in the world was largely green and I don't want to say forested, but certainly full of wildlife and full of fertile ground, right? So this idea of the climate changing is not just a modern idea with respect to what humans are doing. It's something that's constantly enforcing how civilization goes. And I think it's really difficult for us to like look at a desert like Iraq right now and be like, that's a weird place for the birth of civilization to happen at. It was a very, very different place back then. So this is a really nice place back then. And oh, here's a nice map. I probably should have showed this to you guys earlier. But we're talking about this whole region where Iraq is today, right above the Persian Gulf. And most of civilization kind of unfolded there for several thousand years. Eventually, as the climate started to change, right? Of course, the polar ice caps were melting. We were going into this warmer period, very warm. civilizations started to more center on the Mediterranean. Mediterranean is obviously an ideal climate. So we start to see the ascendance of the Greeks later in the Mediterranean, right? And the Egyptians right there on the edge of the Mediterranean as well. So things change. I'm going to skip through this a little bit. But in all of these civilizations, this is the Indus Valley civilization, Egypt, in all of these civilizations, we see the stories, the state-sponsored and the common narrative about the mythological structure that holds up the civilization is not only homogeneous and defined by the state, but it also reflects something about the stars above them, right? There's always these shout-outs to the fact that the gods, the stories, these deity stories, are playing out in the sky as well. And oftentimes, there's a really common thread in that, which I want to get to in a second, which seems to be at the heart of most mythologies. There's this idea, and this is particularly obvious in the astronomy in Mesoamerica, that these gods, that there's kind of this world where the stars sink down to every night. They go down underground. And there's this underworld where, bad things happen, different dramas play out. And then the next day, those dramas are in some sense, resolved. And there's this cyclic pattern to the way that the night sky unfolds every day. The Mesoamericans were obsessed with Venus, for instance. Venus has this really interesting pattern to it. If you watch Venus in the sky, for a couple of hundred days, Venus is visible near the horizon at night, and then it disappears for a few days, and then it's visible in the morning all of a sudden. And so people would tell these stories. There's central mythology, there's central cosmology in the Mayan world, and in the Aztecs, which followed them, centered around this story of the god that they represented with Venus as descending into the underworld and fighting these cosmic battles, which then resulted in a triumph and a change, a metamorphosis into a new form of that deity that would rise in a different location. So this trip to the underworld keeps cropping up and up, and it actually plays out the same in Sumeria, a very similar type of thing. It wasn't actually until probably the time of the Greeks, and much more so in post-Dark Ages Europe, that religion and astronomy started to get into actual gridlock with each other. And this is kind of interesting, because what I'm working towards is that today we've basically taken all mythology, all religion has been completely extracted from our observation of the world in a scientific sense, right? At the same time, people expect more and more of science. They want science to explain the world to them, every little bit of the world, including the origin of the universe itself, which is, in some sense, a unreasonable expectation for a physical discipline. So, one of the first conflicts was this guy, we've talked about him before, Anaxagoras. He was this Greek philosopher. This is probably like 500 BC, so about 2,500 years ago. He basically made one of the first models where he said, I think this is the guy I told you about who saw the meteor land and touched it, and it was hot. And he thought, wow, I think the sun could be a burning rock as well. And he got arrested, actually, for publishing on this, for writing about it, because the sun was supposed to be this deity called Helios at the time. And so that was the state-sponsored narrative about what the sun was. And when this guy came out with this kind of physicalist model of it, it wasn't taken very lightly, right? So this is the first stirrings that we see of there being some conflict between the religious mythological narrative and the physicalist scientific approach to what's happening in the sky. And it just kind of continues all the way up to the Galileo story, the Renaissance, right? People get telescopes, they start looking at these things and being like, I don't think these are just gods in the sky. I think these are actually rocks that are, have their own moons going around them. It's kind of undeniable at some points, and the church caves in. But this was a relatively modern moment where astronomy and religion actually start to come into conflict with each other. So, let's talk about what religion really is. Have you guys ever thought about what's in a religion? Like, what does the word even mean? Anybody? Sure. Did anybody grow up in a religious household or anything like that? Yeah. What is religion to you? What did it mean in your family when you were growing up? Like, what is it? Not the specifics, but like, what role did it play?
Just like believing in some a higher being, that there's a one big person or object or something that brought us all here for a reason.
So it's like this kind of cohesion of this story, right? That holds, in some sense, holds a people together. That's certainly a huge part of it. Yeah.
An organization of beliefs that serves as an explanation for any aspect of life.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. It's an organization of beliefs, yeah. And oftentimes, particularly in less modern times, so if you go back, religions contain a lot of peculiar practices and behaviors, rituals, rites. I grew up in a Lutheran family, and like we did this thing called communion, right? I think the Catholics do it too, right? Where you basically undergo this ceremony, and like it's supposed to be symbolic of consuming like the blood and the body of this deity and so forth. Like, it's really gnarly if you think about it, but it's supposed to be taken as this kind of indoctrination, or this induction into this community where you become part of it, right? So there's these rites and rituals that kind of set a people apart from other people. Actually, the word religion, religios, this is debated in the literature, but to some extent, the word, it means anything from to bind, so like rules that bind you together, to something close to law, right? Which actually, and if you think about it, religion often does overlap with laws. You have in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have these 10 commandments, right? This is how you're supposed to behave and so forth. So there's an element of religion that I want to triage and say is somewhat separate from mythology, although they overlap significantly, because religion often seems to be focused on making a group of people sort of cohesive amongst one another, and even so it goes so far as to outlining laws, which is something that we generally think of as the state's job today. Remember, in the beginning, the state and the religion were one and the same. So the laws that you were upholding were not just because there's some arbitrary authority, but you're literally obeying the law because that's the mandate of the deity, of the god of your day. God wants you to do these laws, and so you do them. Of course, there's probably consequences if you don't, but it's not some human construct to these people. It's actually the right thing to do according to the cosmological structure of the universe that wants you to behave a certain way. They have this word in Sanskrit in India called dharma, which is essentially the same thing as religion, and it also means law. So living according to the dharma is kind of like living according to the laws of the universe, right? And this is where we get all those ideas about karma and so forth emerging as well, which became pretty popular in the West starting in the 1960s. So this seems to be a unified feature of religions, is this insular ability to bind people together under some ways of living, some laws and so forth. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that in the West, in America, in Europe, but particularly in America, religion's never been at an all-time low of popularity as it is today. And that's kind of interesting because science has never been as popular as an authority narrative as it is today. And I think that there's something really interesting that happens in the 20th century that led people to favor one versus the other. Some people have gone so far as to say that religion is just this tyrannical thing. So most famous, obviously this guy, you guys know who this is? It's Marx, exactly. So Marx, famously said that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? It's just this story you tell people to get them through their cold, brutish lives to sort of dull the pain of existence so that they can look forward to this afterlife. But other people, like modern philosophers like Richard Dawkins, called religions the viruses of the mind. He's a very famous scientist. Sam Harris talked about, I got this quote from Sam Harris, that religion is comparable to a mental illness. It allows otherwise normal human beings to reap the fruits of madness and consider them holy. I mean, there's been a lot of antipathy, a lot of pushback against religion in the 20th century, right up to the modern age, which is, I think that we can make sense of that, and I'd be curious to hear from you guys. But it's worth pointing out that Marx's ideals were, tried out, right? The Soviet Union tried to get rid of religion. I don't know if you guys know that. They basically made it a crime. They killed millions of people, in the pursuit of it. They killed all the priests. So the Eastern Orthodox Christianity was a really popular religion in the Tsarist Russia prior to the Soviet Revolution, the Communist Revolution. What's the worst thing you can call somebody these days? Probably a Nazi, right? I mean, the Nazis killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million people that they thought were undesirables. The Soviets killed 60 million people that they thought were undesirable, many of them because they had religious beliefs. Also intellectuals. I mean, they completely hollowed out the intellectual base of this civilization, which probably is the reason that their whole society fell apart. The communist Chinese, there's estimates they killed as many as 100 million people. So we're talking about atrocities that dwarf the Holocaust, which is crazy. So this approach to trying to get people to not think mythologically, not think religiously, and enforcing that seems to be a dead end in some sense. But at the same time, like I said, we have this weird situation today where religions have become less popular in the West than ever before. Now, I think there's, in some sense, like I said, there's good reason for that, because as people became more rational and so forth, they were less willing to entertain the literal translations of these mythological works, right? They have a hard time believing that things like virgin births or angels coming down and performing miracles is a reasonable, rational explanation. But what I'm trying to get you guys to see is that it's not entirely clear that we can live without some sort of uniting mythos, some sort of stories about how we're supposed to get through this world together at the same time. I don't know, why do you guys think that religions are less popular today than they were 100 years ago, for instance? Yeah.
I think the development of technology has something to do with it. We didn't have an alternative to religion in the past because of our lack of access to scientific knowledge.
I think technology is a huge part of it. And I think that technology cuts both ways too. When a lot of this modern when science started to take on the burden of cosmology for the first time, the theory that we're going to be talking about, the Big Bang Theory, was essentially hatched right after World War I. So World War I was, it wasn't the Holocaust, it wasn't the Soviet gulags, but, millions of people died in these trenches in this horrible warfare. And it was the first time that people had mechanized weapons for the first time too. And I think that the world was very much in this kind of shell-shocked state where they were oh my God, science can do so much for us, but it can also just destroy us, right? And so I think that there was a real need for a hope that that science maybe got us into this mess with all these tanks and bombs and machine guns, but it could maybe get us out of it too. And if we just kind of encouraged the scientists in a different direction, that they might be able to turn all those brains towards a better future. And I think that has played out to some extent. But I think that one of the consequences of it is that we expect the scientists to also be able to tell us who we are in this universe and what this universe is here for and what our purpose is in it. And I'm not entirely sure that science has succeeded at that to this point. What else do you guys think in terms of why religion is less popular? Yeah.
Other people's beliefs as well, so that kind of causes.
the specifics of the myths, that like the different religions coming together in one place. Yeah, I think that's also really interesting. So especially America, right? Like America is a place where you can come from all over the world and become an American. And it's really, America is kind of like a meme, right? It's like this, you can be whatever you want to be here. And that's really, really unique still to this day. I mean, I don't know how much you guys have traveled in the world, but it's a pretty strange country where people can be considered equal just based on their merits of what they accomplish, you know? There's still really, really strictly enforced racism in very developed countries. You know, India has a very active caste system, and it's like, if you're born into the wrong family, like there's nothing you can do to get out of it, ever. For anyone, your children will always be in that low rung of society forever. And it's a very strange system, and there's degrees of that all throughout the world. America is a really strange place where all these people come together, set aside their personal different convictions and so forth, and then focus on really a meritocracy of like, well, can you do whatever you do better than the next guy or gal? But yeah, exactly. So bringing together all these ideas kind of forces people to set it aside a little bit. And you know, our country is one of the first countries, to my knowledge, to really try to put that, like to center that idea in our legislation. So we had this idea pretty early on that, and the Supreme Courts have fought this out from year to year, that religion and the state should be separate, right? We shouldn't teach religion in schools. We shouldn't bring religious arguments into the courts. These are two separate matters. You want to do your religion, great, but it has nothing to do with the laws that govern our society. That's a really radical idea. You know, and there's also this, along these lines, there's this really strange finding. So every once in a while they'll do studies about religion, and they'll go and survey people. There was a huge study in 2019 by the Pew Research Foundation. And they went and looked at different aspects of people's lives, people who were in religious communities, people who didn't have religious communities. And they essentially found that people who had religious practices in religious communities were, on balance, far happier than people who didn't. So that's a really interesting element to weigh here, too. So as the West becomes more and more of a technically superior entity, more freedom is permitted. There's less differences based on race and gender. We've ironed these things out. But still, the people who kind of stick with this somewhat unpopular religious motif seem to be happier in the long run. Why do you guys think that is? It's weird. Maybe it's not weird. I don't think it's that weird, but yeah, what do you think?
I think it's part of the ability to find comfort in having a solid belief of what comes after, or having some faith in a higher power that has control, when as an atheist or as in a different religion, there's less control, and that affects how comfortable you feel in your own life.
I think that's a huge part of it. Does anybody have anything to add to that? Yeah, them. Meaning, yeah. Orientation towards the future, perhaps. I mean, there's obviously the element of just having a club of people to hang out with who are your friends all of a sudden, too. Like having a church is a community, right? It's like being part of a team. Team sports kind of do the same thing. Brooke, remind me, what was the point one more time?
Having someone that has control.
And telling you about the afterlife and so forth. Something to look forward to, giving you a story, a cohesive story, exactly. I think that's really interesting. And I think that in some sense, when we're moving in this physics story towards a cosmology and these stories of the stars and so forth, in some sense, what the physicists are trying to do is take on that burden of reassuring you that somebody knows the answer. There is, just in the same way a religious narrative will give you a story of the universe, the physics story of the universe is trying to speak for everything all at once. The cosmologies literally are trying to tell you that somebody understands where the universe came from and where it's going. You know, almost every single time in this class, I don't think I've ever taught this class where somebody didn't ask, what's going to happen to our sun? It's a reasonable question, you know? I think I asked that question at some point, right? I think it's a very reasonable thing. And it's nice to know that somebody thinks they have the answer to that, right? Now, in the past, maybe that wouldn't have been the question that you would ask because you probably wouldn't be thinking of the sun as a star that's burning hydrogen and all of this stuff. Maybe you would have different questions about the future of the planets and so forth that would have different cosmological answers. But we certainly appreciate and we give the authority to the people who are able to tell a story that's cohesive and coherent and explains the fate of our planet and explains what's going to happen and how much time do we have to figure it out and all of that. That sort of starts to, in some sense, take on the mantle of these religious super stories that have been so popular in the past. And so I see something really interesting just happening in the last 100 years where as the religious stories have kind of lost authority for a lot of people, particularly in a state that disavows religion having anything to do with it, you see the scientists getting more authority and having more answers for questions about the fate of the planet, the fate of the species. You really start to see scientists stepping up to the plate and trying to take on a lot of those duties that we formerly would have ascribed to religion. So, you know, I'm going to skip this. So then we get to the point where we start talking about myth versus religion. And I think to this point, I've kind of conflated the two, myth and religion. What do you think is different about a myth versus a religion? Anybody? Yeah.
A myth is a story to explain something, while the religion is like the entire collection of the stories and how they work.
I think that's pretty spot on, yeah. So a myth is like a specific story. A religion is kind of a collection of those stories that united people together in some sense. Now, do you guys think we still have myths today? Where do they live? What's that?
The myth of like the Earth's flat either through the sky.
That's an interesting myth. Yeah, that's almost it's almost a broken scientific myth of some sort. So yeah, I would say, but I mean, all right, so Jasmine's bringing up flat Earth, obviously, as a myth. I would say, yeah, flat Earth is a myth. So is round Earth, though. Right? It's not that it's not true, because I think that's one thing that I want to start to point you guys towards. Myths often contain a lot of truth in them, actually. And I'm going to go through one with you guys today before we close out, in particular, that has a lot of truth in it. Now, it's not literally true, right? But there's some elements of truth that are so true that they're almost more true than facts. They're just so representative of what we all go through on a daily basis that they're undoubtedly true. They're just not literally true. Where else do myths live, like today? Yeah, that's a great one. The American dream, exactly. Anybody can become president. How about that myth? That's really interesting. Is it true? You know what I mean? It's like, actually, if you look at the people who become presidents, like they're often from a dynasty of some sort. Are there exceptions to that? Definitely. So it's true with like some caveats, right? You definitely need to be in the right place at the right time as well. But even the dream that you can become anything is a little bit mythological, and there's some truth to that and some not truth to it. I mean, can you become anything? Can you, if you work really hard, can you become an astronaut? Maybe not though, right? You know, there's a lot of luck and happenstance that goes into anybody's lives, right? You might just be passed over for completely insignificant reasons, like you just happen to not be in the right place at the right time or know the right person or whatever. So there's elements of these myths. I'm trying to like reach for some other ones that are more cultural. Like where else do we see myths today persisting? And by myths, I mean kind of these overarching stories that guide us. Where do we see this stuff? How about Hollywood? I mean, literature, perhaps. Literature that seems to be less popular than ever before. But I see Netflix and Hollywood. I see stuff like lyrical music, like hip hop, rock music was huge for me when I was going up through college. I really loved playing in bands and stuff like that. I really loved lyrical music because the stories that are told in folk music, they're often so epic and they can actually guide you towards how to live. Like you almost see how people screwed up their lives in these stories in a way that you can kind of orient your life differently as a result of it. And I think that's kind of the point of myths, is that they're these stories that kind of show you the consequences of your behaviors ahead of time. And we showcase them and hand them down generation to generation. And the fact that they're these kind of supernatural beings and so forth, I think that literal aspect is not the important part. The reason they use these supernatural beings and stuff is probably because it's memorable, kind of like cartoons or something. It's really easy to remember if I tell you about some fire-breathing dragon fighting this knight who's rescuing this princess and stuff. It's a lot easier than if I tell you like some specific doldrum story of, you know, me conquering some fear in my life and, you know, profiting from it as an individual. So there's something saleable about it, and I think the myths do persist in our culture, and I think they persist in science as well. It's just a matter of how usable are they on different levels. Obviously, the stories we tell in science are as useful as they are technologically productive, usually, right? So the story we have told about stars, these gaseous stars, I mean, in some sense, that's been a really productive myth for a while, right? It worked. It got people over the question of how are the stars powered for 50, 100 years. But now that people are trying to put that story into a technological solution, like making a little star on Earth, like a fusion reactor, it doesn't seem to be really working out for them anymore, right? And so periodically, these myths have to be adapted in science as well, these stories, these meta stories. Let me give you guys, I'm going to skip through this piece here. Come back to that. All right, so let me just give you guys an example. So this story, this is the story of Andromeda. So this is the Greek version, although this Greeks lifted this story from the Sumerians. And they were talking about this constellation in the sky. It turns out Andromeda is actually a galaxy. If you do a really long exposure of the sky, you can actually see this nice, beautiful spiral galaxy, which is Andromeda. But for whatever reason, these peoples, going all the way back to the Sumerians, told this very kind of concerted story, it turns out, about this monster and this fight against this monster. So I want you guys to like think about this story that I tell you, and it's obviously a very surreal, superstitious story, but I want you guys to kind of think about what's valuable, why in the heck people kept telling this story for thousands of years, because it probably isn't just because it's entertaining. It's been too popular and it's been telephoned down through the ages for some reason. So the basic idea was that Andromeda was this beautiful princess, the daughter of Cassiopeia and Cephas, who are these Ethiopian king and queen. And the mother, Cassiopeia, is bragging to these little like demons, basically, who are kind of the henchmen of Poseidon, the sea god, about how beautiful her daughter is. You know, my daughter's the most beautiful woman in all of the land. And the little nymph demons get kind of jealous and they go and tell Poseidon. And Poseidon sends a sea monster to come and steal the princess away. So steals Andromeda. And basically, the nymphs, from what I recall, they chain Andromeda to these rocks by the sea, and they just kind of leave her out for the sea monster to come and destroy her. And of course, the king and the queen are freaking out because their most precious daughter has been disappeared. Meanwhile, this hero of our story, named Perseus, who's been involved in another quest recently. He was actually out just murdering Medusa, who's the snake-headed demon. He happens to just see her by the rocks. And he goes and visits her. And he spends all this time basically trying to figure out who she is. And he just won't give up. He's like, tell me your name. If you tell me your name, I'll leave you alone. And so finally she tells him her name. he figures out who she is, goes to the king and queen. He's like, look, I can deal with this sea monster for you, but you have to let me marry your daughter if I pull it off, basically. And they do it. They give him permission. They're like, yeah, you can marry our daughter. Just kill the monster. So he kills the monster, and long story short, everything goes back to normal. The daughter's rescued. Everybody's happy. And Poseidon and the sea entities are terrified of this hero, and they don't bother the village anymore. So, that's the overarching general picture of this myth. But what's kind of interesting is you see this same myth crop up all the time, actually. So, famous example in medieval Europe is St. George and the Dragon, right? Dragons terrifying this town, right? The people are just like, well, it sucks this dragon is burning our houses down and eating our children, but it's a dragon. What are you going to do about it? It's like it's got breathes fire out of its face. It's got claws and horns and what are you going to do? Then this knight steps up, right? And St. George, and he's basically like, look, I can take care of this dragon for you guys. He does. It's all very scary. And then in the end, they essentially elevate this guy to this position of sainthood. He becomes, almost like deified by the culture as a result of it. So there's an interesting lesson involved in all of that. I mean, there's a number of them. I'm curious if anything sticks out to you guys on the face of it. Why do we keep telling this story over and over and over again? What's up with these dragons? Because no one's ever seen a dragon before. Yeah.
By destroying something monstrous or in an outgroup, you are rewarded and get a prize, and you're doing a good thing by destroying that monster or something that doesn't belong.
Yeah. I mean that's certainly like the heart of it is in some sense that it takes kind of a unique individual to face something that everybody else is just kind of like, it's a monster. What are you going to do about it? There's some sort of courage that has to be mustered. There's also this element, I didn't even mention this, of usually in all these serpent or dragon stories, the hero has some sort of magical weapon. And that's kind of interesting too, because you think about people who come up with solutions to problems, they often have technological inventions or they have some sort of approach or technique to attacking some problem that has never been thought of before. So there's certainly that element. What else? Yeah.
I'd say that there's a relation to a lot of the men being like sort of saviors amongst men or some common person that becomes a hero by fighting this monster.
Like an element that almost that American dream thing, right? That hey, if you step up in the face of something that's terrorizing your society, you will be elevated as a result of it. I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. I think that, despite the fact that no one's ever seen an actual dragon walking down the street, I think there's dragons everywhere, to be honest with you. I think they're in each one of our lives, too. They crop up. You might have a disagreement with your romantic partner or something, right? And there's certainly, depending on your personality, I'm very passive when it comes to stuff like conflicts with people. I tend to just be pretend like nothing's happening, right? Because I just don't like having conflicts with people. But that's kind of dumb, and it lacks some courage too, because what happens is if these little things start off as just a little problem, they can grow into something really big over time if you don't deal with them. And so there's definitely something true about if you have the courage to step up and face something and deal with it on its face, you'll be rewarded in any level of aspect. So it could be, these myths tend to recapitulate patterns in our lives that happen not just at the scale of saving a whole town, but they're also happening on your own individual interpersonal levels too, all throughout your lives. There's something about them which we might call archetypical or meta. It's a meta phenomenon, right? The story encapsulates some sort of pattern of behavior that is true, not just, at the societal level, not just at the, your friend group, but all the way down into the way that your own mind operates on a daily basis. What about this thing with Cassiopeia bragging about her daughter's beauty and starting the whole pickle in the first place. Any thoughts about that?
Being proud and not humble is a bad thing that will lead to consequences.
Yeah, why do you think that is? Well, first of all, do you think that's true? Anybody? Yeah.
I feel like every action leads up to a consequence. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. It'll lead up to something. So if you're bragging about something, eventually something's gonna come back to get you.
Someone's going to challenge you for sure. That's for sure. Yeah, I think there's an element of there's some elements, and of course the details of the story I've blown over, and I encourage you guys to read the actual Greek versions of these myths if you're interested. But there's this element of each one of us goes through the world, and I don't know if this has dawned on you guys yet, but I'm sure it will at some point. But the fantasy of yourself. So when you think of yourself, if I was to ask you to tell me about who you are, like what are your defining features? Well, you're probably going to tell me all the best things about you, right? Like you're not going to tell me that, like, yeah, sometimes I lie about little things, and sometimes I, steal little things, or right? People in general, all of us, tend to imagine the best versions of ourselves when we think about who I am, like. Who am I, right? And I think that's fine because it allows us to actually be functional in the world and not be completely depressed about our shortcomings. But at the same time, we can fall in love with that fantasy version of ourselves, and it can open up a huge blind spot to the things that other people see that we stopped seeing about ourselves. And I think that myth of pride that's at the heart of that story as well kind of points to it as well. The queen thought that she was responsible for the beauty of her daughter and this kingdom and everything, but the reality of the situation was that the gods themselves took a lot of responsibility for it as well, and circumstance and the sea gods and everything were like, well, oh, you think that you're not vulnerable to all of these other aspects of nature, we'll show you, kind of thing. So, we could just pick apart this myth forever. There's elements that go all the way down, and that's sort of something about mythology that makes it so powerful. It's just that there's onion layers. You can keep peeling back and keep peeling back. And what I would submit to you is that a cosmology is kind of the biggest meta myth that we can tell. It is the story of the whole universe. And the meta mythology, the cosmology that we have today, developed by physicists in the last 50 years, essentially, this Big Bang cosmology, it's not clear to me what saleable advice it has for us on how we should live our lives, essentially. Now, that doesn't mean either that it's not true or that it isn't valuable. The question is, where does that cosmology live that we actually can call on for guidance in our world? And I kind of pointed to a few places for it. But the reality of the situation is that we have to kind of construct that for ourselves in some sense. We find our own personal mythologies, which is really difficult and dangerous, and it makes your 20s really, really hard because you're trying to figure out who you're supposed to be and what's the right way to be and how do you treat people, how do you treat yourself. It's not as simple of a situation because as we've become more of a scientifically minded society, we've become less interested in these cohesive myths that kind of wrap us all together and tell us exactly how we should live, which is both beautiful and, perilous at the same time because it puts more responsibility on the individual to sort it out. So, freedom's great. Freedom to choose who you want to be is great, but it's also much harder than being born into a culture where, in some sense, all of that is prescribed for you. This is exactly what you be. Your dad was a blacksmith, you're going to be a blacksmith. That's just the way it works. So I guess to kind of close this down, I don't think that it's unreasonable that the scientists, particularly the physicists, have taken on the mantle of cosmology onto themselves. But at the same time, it might be a somewhat unreasonable task to expect scientists looking at the material world to be able to give us an overarching story for the universe. Because the universe is so much about you and your lives and how you interact with people and the consequences of your actions. And none of that can be captured by physics alone. So, I don't know. Why don't you guys think about that over the weekend, and we can talk about, a proper home for cosmology when we get back together over the weekend. But I really appreciate you guys braving the weather and coming out here today. And we'll get back into the physics next week. So have a good weekend, guys.